In July of 2026, Melissa Gilbert described a friendship that had arrived almost 52 years after Little House on the Prairie first placed her beside Melissa Sue Anderson. Anderson, she said, had become a good and true confidant. She cared about how Gilbert was doing. She checked on her and made sure she was all right. Gilbert called them real friends. The words mattered because the two actresses had never claimed that playing Laura and Mary made them close as children. They worked together, sometimes clashed, and remembered important parts of those years differently. Yet the record does not show one unbroken 50-year war. It shows something quieter: distance, comparison, occasional contact, and a public story that often became more certain than either woman's evidence allowed. By Gilbert's summer 2026 account, the distance had become friendship. The question is how two children who could create sisterhood for millions, but not for themselves, finally learned to meet without a script. If quiet journeys into the lives behind Little House bring you comfort, you're warmly invited to subscribe. You can also find our ebook and 3 little books at prairiesecrets.com. Thank you for being here. Settle in now and let the story unfold. Long before either woman could reconsider the other, each had to survive a room in which adults were deciding who she would become. Before the adults deciding who would play Mary Ingalls had ever seen Melissa Sue Anderson, another adult had noticed something less obvious than her blue eyes. Anderson had asthma as a child. In her later account, her mother enrolled her in dance because the exercise might help develop her lungs. The lesson began as a practical response to a body that sometimes made breathing difficult. It also placed the shy girl in a room where movement could be learned one count at a time. The route was not a family tradition being passed down. Anderson later described herself as the child who wanted the work. Once acting appeared beside dance, she wanted an agent and began learning what the business required. Her mother managed the practical steps, but the wish did not have to be planted by a stage parent. That distinction would matter later. When Anderson defended her seriousness, she was defending a choice she believed had begun with her, not a childhood occupation imposed from outside. Commercial work could be repetitive and uncertain, yet she returned because performance gave effort a visible result. Her dance teacher believed a well-rounded performer should know how to act as well as dance. Expression entered beside posture and rhythm. A later profile described a chance meeting with an agent, followed by commercials associated with Sears and Mattel and small parts on the Brady Bunch and Shaft. Anderson discovered that stepping into a part could feel easier than presenting herself without one. A role gave the shy child something shaped to do. The credits were brief, but they changed the conditions under which she entered the Little House search. Anderson was not arriving from an ordinary school day to discover, for the first time, that a camera could separate one child from another. She already knew about auditions, waiting, marks, repeated takes, and the peculiar concentration required when adults compared young performers in the same room. She also knew that the camera could reward stillness. A child who did not fill silence socially could still make silence useful in a close-up. The reserve that would later be interpreted in so many personal ways had already found one place where it could become a skill. None of this made the 11-year-old secure. Experience could not tell her whether Landon would see Mary, Laura, or no Ingalls' daughter at all. It only taught her that being wanted for one job did not protect a child from losing the next. The asthma had led to dance. Dance had opened acting. Commercials and small roles had taught her how quickly an opportunity could begin and end. By the time she entered the makeshift schoolroom where girls were being paired and repaired, work had already become a language she trusted. The Little House audition would decide how much of her childhood that language was about to occupy. Melissa Sue Anderson remembered the search for Mary as a narrowing field. About 50 girls were considered at first. Then came a room of NBC executives. About 25 were left to read for Michael Landon. After that came a screen test. Anderson was 11, and the waiting seemed to last forever. In another recollection, casting director Susan McCrae said Anderson was first considered for Laura before Landon recognised her as Mary. The accounts can live together. Children were paired and repaired. roles remained unsettled until the people controlling the production decided which face belonged to which daughter. Anderson remembered the audition area as a makeshift school. One girl read opposite another, then the combinations changed and they read again. The process did not permit a child to settle into one imagined family. Each new pairing changed the rhythm, the height relationship, and the face across from her. Even the role could change while the adults watched. When the testing ended, no one handed Anderson a victory scene. She left believing the opportunity had passed. Her mother took her and another girl from the auditions for ice cream, and the girls played basketball. Roughly a week later, the telephone did more than deliver a part. It reversed an ending Anderson had already accepted. She had been chosen as Mary. Anderson later learned that her pale blue eyes had made a strong impression on film. She did not tell the story as if appearance were enough. Her response was that the acting had to live up to what the camera first noticed. Melissa Gilbert's route to Laura contained its own strange mixture of adult certainty and childhood accident. She knew hundreds of girls were trying out. Her family understood what meeting the former Bonanza star meant. Gilbert did not. She had never watched the show. Her grandfather typed the audition scenes for her, and Gilbert entered the room, heard Landon laugh, and understood why the adults around her had been excited. The screen test did not ask her to sparkle in a general way. It placed her inside one of the pilot's quietest losses. Laura believes that Jack, the family dog, has drowned while crossing a river. Pa refuses to offer the comfort she wants. He speaks instead about the stars and the possibility that what has disappeared may still be present in another form. Gilbert played the scene opposite Landon. She remembered looking up and seeing tears in his eyes. His emotion brought hers almost immediately. Decades later, she described the connection as something almost symbiotic. Each could set off an emotional response in the other, and Little House would depend on that exchange for years. The important decision happened after the child had gone home. Gilbert said she learned much later that Landon did not take a group of Laura tests to NBC. He took hers. In her recollection, he did not invite the network to choose among several girls. He presented Gilbert as the choice he had already made. The network's answer still had to pass through adult channels, but the news escaped those channels first. Gilbert attended the Buckley School with members of Landon's family. Near the lunch area, Leslie Landon approached her and said that her father believed Gilbert would be Laura. Gilbert ran to the school office, called the situation an emergency, and telephoned her mother. Her mother had heard nothing. The agents had heard nothing. Calls moved back through the representatives and network until the unofficial message was confirmed. Leslie was punished for revealing it. For Gilbert, the part therefore arrived as both a professional decision and a schoolyard secret. Before a representative could explain what the role might mean, another child had already placed her inside the Landon family's knowledge of the future. Anderson's casting memory had moved through shrinking groups waiting and a telephone call after she believed the opportunity was gone. Gilbert's ended with Landon withholding alternatives from the network and his daughter breaking the news at school. Neither girl designed the difference. Yet before the cameras turned, one child had been cast as the older daughter, and the other had discovered that the most powerful man on the production felt an immediate emotional certainty about her. Neither child controlled what adults saw. Once the choices were made, however, those first impressions became working identities. Anderson was the eldest daughter, composed, responsible, watchful. Gilbert was the younger centre of motion, curious, impulsive, emotionally open. The production did not invent all their differences, but it gave those differences costumes, dialogue, and consequences. Before those differences could be edited into a family drama, the cast had to get through the weather. The pilot moved between Stockton and Sonora, California. In Stockton, rain softened the ground until the production's heavy trucks sank into the mud. Equipment still had to reach its place, costumes had to remain usable, and a schedule built on daylight had to continue. Sonora brought snow and a different kind of cold. The town looked suitable for a story about endurance, But making endurance visible required more than waiting for the weather. For one rain sequence, sprinklers added water from above, while the cast worked through freezing conditions below. Their clothes became soaked. The scene asked the actors to appear as a family caught in bad weather. The production made sure the weather could be seen. Anderson later remembered shaking so hard afterward that she could not open the door of her dressing room. Grassel, Cold herself, opened it for her. It is a small memory with no villain and no moral. The water was cold. A child's hands would not cooperate, and an adult nearby helped. This was the quiet beginning of the shared production history. Before viewers decided which sister seemed warmer, prouder, kinder, or more difficult, both girls were learning the same first lesson about television. A finished scene hides the work that made it possible. On screen, the rain belonged to the Ingalls family. Off-screen, it belonged to pumps, hoses, wet fabric, a door handle, and the few minutes required for a child to stop trembling. Landon tested Anderson's control in lighter ways. She remembered him trying to make her laugh at the end of close-ups. He wanted the break. She refused to give it to him. On another day, he challenged her to a chili and onions contest. Anderson could no longer remember who won because the food made her so sick. The memories are useful precisely because they do not fit one mood. The child who guarded her concentration could participate in a ridiculous contest with the boss. The man who demanded deference could spend time trying to crack her composure. Anderson's recollections contain play, irritation, authority, and later professional trust without becoming simple. The pilot was broadcast on March 30th, 1974. At that point, Anderson was 11 and Gilbert was 9. When the regular series premiered on September 11th, Gilbert had turned 10. The gap was less than 2 years. In adult life, it would nearly disappear. In a child's world, it could establish rank. Once the series began, the girls' working day developed a rhythm that belonged to neither childhood nor ordinary employment. There were locations, sets, wardrobe, makeup, rehearsal, filming, and school. A child could be needed for a close-up and an arithmetic lesson in the same hour. Production divided the school day and fitted its pieces around the camera. During the pilot, Anderson remembered the studio teacher as frighteningly strict. The children carried books and assignments in suitcases. Between scenes, they worked at a long wooden table inside the school trailer, a regulated workplace where dialogue and schoolwork waited together. When the regular series followed, Mrs. Helen Keller became their teacher. Both Anderson and Gilbert later remembered her with warmth. That change mattered because the basic pressure did not disappear. The girls still had lines to memorize, scenes to perform, and required school hours to complete before the day was over. A kind teacher could make the system gentler. She could not make it simple. Gilbert remembered assistant directors finding her when it was time to return to lessons. The message was sometimes addressed to Half Pint, the name that joined actress and character even when the request had nothing to do with Laura Ingalls. She might leave a world of horses, wagons, and buttoned boots, then enter a trailer where the clock measured a different duty. Gilbert experienced much of the production with a child's delight. The high button boots fascinated her. Someone taught her to use a button hook. There were real horses, cows, chickens, crew members who knew how to make a child laugh, and other young actors with whom she could play. The costumes added their own demands. Long dresses held heat in Simi Valley. Anderson remembered Black Shoes becoming so hot that the bottoms of her feet seemed to burn. At 16, she joked, she could not even wear nail polish because Mary Ingalls would not have. The girls were making a 19th century story under 20th century labour rules. The schoolroom is easy to overlook because it never appeared in an episode. Yet it may be one of the truest images of the childhood Anderson and Gilbert shared. They spent years in the same production and many hours in the same school space, but those hours were structured. One might be called to set while the other remained with an assignment. One might be learning a scene while the other was finishing required class time. They shared a table, a teacher, a schedule, and an unusual childhood occupation. None of those things required them to share the same temperament. Familiarity accumulated. Friendship was a separate matter. Gilbert remembered the set as unusually welcoming to children, but welcome did not mean that children were treated as visitors. When the camera turned, the adult performers and crew expected the young actors to know the job. Gilbert said that being regarded as a working peer made the responsibility feel like a gift. The adults trusted her with something difficult because they believed she could do it. The trust had a practical edge. The crew had worked together across earlier series and moved quickly. A missed mark or an unlearned page did not inconvenience only the person who made the mistake. It held actors, camera operators, sound workers, animal handlers, costume staff, and daylight in place. Professional standards therefore crossed the age line. For Gilbert, this structure felt supportive rather than confining. She described the children as contained but not caged. The phrase separates the safety of a controlled workplace from the fantasy that the set had no boundaries. Adults knew where the children were, school hours were counted, work was supervised. Within that structure, Gilbert could feel wonder and competence at once. Anderson responded to much of the same structure by watching, preparing, and limiting what followed her home. Gilbert responded by moving deeper into the community that trusted her. The system did not assign those responses, but it gave each child a reason to believe her own method worked. At the time, sitting across from someone did not mean knowing her. The production required a different kind of closeness. Mary and Laura had to move through the Ingalls house as if they had always known where the other would stand. They shared a bed, chores, school benches, danger, disappointment, and the private looks of sisters surrounded by adults. A camera might begin on one girl's face and depend on the other girl's response to complete the feeling. Viewers saw family because the children delivered it. One of their earliest episodes, Country Girls, aired only a week after the regular premiere. Caroline Ingalls brings home fabric for new dresses. Laura reaches toward it. Mary slaps her hand away. Gilbert later said Anderson struck much harder than she expected. The camera, she believed, caught a quick sequence of genuine feeling as she tried to remain inside the scene. Gilbert remembered the incident because the scripted hierarchy and the working hierarchy seemed to meet in the same physical moment. Mary corrected Laura. The older actress corrected the younger one. Fabric became the object through which Gilbert remembered being placed below Anderson. The scene does not prove Anderson intended to hurt her. It does not establish a pattern of bullying. It is one child's later account of how a filmed action landed. Its importance is not as evidence for a prosecution. Its importance is that Gilbert kept it. Early episodes gave them many other shared actions, most of them less charged. Laura developed a crush on Johnny Johnson, only to discover that he preferred Mary. Mary tried to repair Laura's broken doll by bringing home an orphaned raccoon, Jasper. In Remember Me, the sisters went into the water to rescue puppies. Peppermint sticks and tin cups passed through their working childhood. These were scripted objects and events, yet they became part of the real memories stored around the girls who performed them. The sequence unfolded quickly. The Love of Johnny Johnson aired in October of 1974, before the actresses had completed even a full season together. The story asked Gilbert to play a younger sister watching a boy look past her toward Mary. Whatever existed off camera, the script was already using Anderson as the figure against whom Laura measured herself. The following month, the raccoon reversed the emotional action. Mary accidentally breaks Laura's china doll and tries to make amends by bringing home Jasper. Anderson and Gilbert had to play injury, guilt, repair, and shared fear around an animal that eventually appears rabid. The first season soon gave Landon certainty about Gilbert a working form. During the first season, the production left its usual routine for The Lord is My Shepherd. Landon had written the two-part story around Laura's grief after the death of the Ingalls baby boy. The location work took Gilbert north to the Sonora area. She later remembered that she was the only child actor taken on that portion of the trip. The difference was physical as well as professional. The ordinary schoolroom group was gone. Anderson was not sitting across from her between scenes. Gilbert found herself among Landon, Victor French, and guest star Ernest Borgnine, men old enough to seem like fathers or grandfathers to her. The location surrounded her with adult attention, while the script asked Laura to believe she'd lost her place in Pa's heart. That overlap should not be used to claim that every tear came from Gilbert's private life. The scene remained written and directed work. What Gilbert said was that the final reunion with Landon became unusually real for both of them. At the top of the mountain, Pa finds Laura after she's run away to ask God to exchange her life for her dead brothers. Gilbert remembered Landon becoming overwhelmed. His response pulled hers forward until she struggled to speak. The episode aired in December of 1974, only months after the regular series began. It established something viewers could feel without knowing how it had been produced. Laura was not only the daughter through whose eyes stories began. Gilbert could carry a long emotional movement away from the ensemble, then make its ending depend on her connection with Landon. Anderson would soon earn Landon's trust through control, preparation, and increasingly difficult material of her own. Gilbert's early trust had a different shape. It was built around emotional access and a relationship with the man who played her father. The production had found two capable girls. It was already teaching them that capability would be recognized in different ways. In November of 1975, Remember Me put both girls into the water to rescue a sack of puppies. The work was physical, coordinated, and built around the audience's certainty that Mary and Laura would act together when something vulnerable needed them. None of these plots can be used as evidence that the actresses privately felt what the characters felt. They were evidence of what the actresses did together. They repeated scenes until timing matched, carried the same props, entered cold water, and built a store of images Gilbert would still be naming in 2026. That distinction gives the working years more substance than either Secret Sisters or Secret Enemies. Anderson and Gilbert possessed a real shared childhood made of labour. It simply was not the friendship viewers assumed the labour represented. On screen, Mary's place above Laura was stable. Off-screen, Gilbert later said Anderson was the boss of me. At 9 or 10, she felt the older girl took her authority seriously. Gilbert also found the easy friendship she wanted somewhere else. Alison Arngrim played Laura's enemy Nellie, but she and Gilbert laughed, played, and became close away from the camera. Anderson did not join that rhythm. Her own accounts suggest that she approached work differently. In a 2010 interview, she remembered Gilbert as a child who did her job and then wanted to play, while Anderson wanted to keep learning the craft. She was careful not to claim she knew whether Gilbert wanted acting as a lifelong career. She knew only what she wanted for herself. This distinction should not be exaggerated into the story of a serious child and a careless one. Gilbert knew her lines and carried enormous responsibility. She later said the set respected children as workers so long as they arrived prepared. The crew moved quickly, and unprofessional behaviour from an adult or child could not be allowed to waste time. Both girls were professionals. They simply took different paths through the minutes when no camera was running. Gilbert's ease with feeling did not excuse her from preparation. A few years into the series, she arrived for one scene without knowing the dialogue well enough. She forgot the lines, tried again, and forgot them again. Landon stopped the work. Gilbert remembered him asking quietly whether she had learned the scene. Being discovered was enough to make her cry. He did not humiliate her in front of the company. He sent the others away or called a short break, took a script and walked aside with her. They repeated the lines back and forth until she could hold them. Then he allowed the reassurance to end. As Gilbert started to return, Landon stopped her and made clear that the failure could not happen again. Gilbert later said that it did not. The memory corrects an easy contrast between the actresses. Anderson described herself as the child who wanted to keep learning the craft while Gilbert wanted to play. Gilbert did play, but she also carried the dialogue of the series' central child. One lapse taught her that Landon's affection would not protect her from the schedule's standard. Preparation did not always mean waiting for a script to reach her. Gilbert said she went into the writers' offices before the next episode was distributed and asked what they were doing. She was not proposing storylines or controlling Mary's material. She wanted to know how heavily Laura would appear and whether the workload might allow her to return to an ordinary school for a short time. Usually it did not. Laura was present so often that Gilbert's education bent around production. The child who received the show's warm centre also carried its repeated demand. More lines, more tutor hours, and fewer days among ordinary classmates. The writer's office, therefore, became a place where Gilbert tried to recover a little advanced knowledge from an adult system. She could not decide whether Mary received a showcase or whether Laura drove the next episode. She could discover how completely the coming week would belong to the job. Anderson protected herself by treating the set as a workplace she could leave at the end of the day. Gilbert moved more deeply inside it, learning its offices, crews, rhythms, and sources of authority. The same centrality that gave her greater visibility also made the production harder to separate from the rest of her childhood. Anderson later named Victor French, Kevin Hagen, Richard Bull, and Dabbs Greer among the older actors from whom she learned. Her social world on the production was not empty. Much of it was oriented toward adults and craft rather than toward the friendship group forming around Gilbert. Gilbert reached outward. She enjoyed other children, crew members, animals, and the feeling of being part of Landon's larger world. Anderson listened more than she spoke. She cultivated friends outside the business and tried to leave the industry behind when she went home. The result was not daily warfare. It was an absence where viewers assumed a sisterly bond must be. The first major change in Anderson's position came because a scene unexpectedly had to depend on her. During work on the raccoon, Landon became too ill to complete the reverse close-up that would ordinarily have shared a conversation between two performers. Anderson had already done her side. Without Landon's matching shot, the finished scene had to remain on the young actress. The accident changed the visual burden. A normal exchange could move between speaker and listener, using the second angle to shape pace and emphasis. This time, the available material required Anderson's photographed side to keep working through the part of the exchange an editor could not cover with Landon. The test was created by illness, not designed as an audition. According to Anderson, people overseeing the work were impressed that the scene still played. Soon afterward, Mary received the demanding central material in the award. Anderson treated the episode as a chance to prove what she could carry. The episode placed Mary's ambition at the centre, rather than using her as the careful witness to Laura's adventure. Mary studies late for a school competition and accidentally starts a fire in the barn. A valuable book is destroyed. She conceals what happened, then works at the Olsen store to repay the loss while continuing to prepare for the contest. For Anderson, the importance was not the sequence of misfortunes, it was duration. The story stayed with Mary as effort became error became secrecy, and secrecy demanded a decision. Anderson's performance had to sustain changes that could not be supplied by Landon's reaction shot. When the work succeeded, Mary began receiving better material. In Anderson's recollection, the scene convinced adults that the older daughter could carry more. The advancement did not alter Gilbert's formal place at the centre of the series. It created a second source of dramatic authority. Laura drove the continuing journey. Mary could increasingly become the person on whom a demanding episode rested. That professional state was stable even when the girls' private relationship was not growing. Anderson did not need social closeness with Gilbert to earn more difficult work. Gilbert did not need to surrender Laura's centrality for Anderson to succeed. For a time, the production found room for both kinds of value. In 1975, that value was recognised as an ensemble. Anderson and Gilbert shared a Western Heritage Award for fictional television drama with Landon, Grassel, and executive producer Ed Friendly. The record does not establish that the girls attended a ceremony together, so the award should not be staged as a private triumph. Its meaning is professional. Adults judging the series saw one family drama, and both young actresses were named inside the honour. Before individual comparisons sharpened, their work was publicly recognised as part of the same achievement. That was the stable condition the production wanted. Mary and Laura contributing different strengths to one believable household. The disturbance came when Anderson's strongest individual success also began narrowing the future of her character. The ensemble honour did not pause the separate tests each actress was beginning to face. Gilbert remained the continuing centre, while Anderson's preparation had earned Landon's trust with demanding material. The next test carried that trust beyond the weekly series. In 1976, Landon cast Anderson in The Loneliest Runner, a television film based partly on his own painful childhood. She played Nancy Rizzi, a new classmate and neighbour who takes an interest in a boy, humiliated by bedwetting and driven to run. Lance Kerwin carried the central role while Landon wrote, produced, directed, and appeared as the boy's adult self. NBC broadcast the film on December 20th. Its structure begins with the boy grown into a champion runner, then turns backward toward the humiliations that first sent him running. Anderson's Nancy belongs to the childhood half of that design. She takes an interest in him while shame is still organising his life. The role was not large enough to turn Anderson into the film's centre. Its significance lies elsewhere. Landon chose an actress he already directed each week, and placed her inside a semi-autobiographical story drawn from his humiliating childhood experience with bedwetting. The assignment extended their working relationship beyond Walnut Grove without pretending that professional confidence erased the power between them. Anderson was no longer being used only as the calm older Ingalls daughter. Landon had brought her into material personal enough to expose his own childhood shame. She later said the film helped her understand him. Their relationship was not simple. Anderson remembered him as a great friend and an important teacher, but she also described a powerful man with insecurities and a capacity to lash out. In a near-contemporary interview after she left Little House, she explained the protocol actors learned around him. They did not walk off. They did not argue. If they wanted to propose a different choice, they approached carefully and asked whether it might be all right. Often, the answer was no. Anderson remained grateful. She also knew the limits of her influence. That combination, trust from Landon and submission to his authority, could look like confidence from across the set, while still leaving Anderson limited in how much input she could exercise. Gilbert, meanwhile, had entered the production with a bond to Landon that extended beyond work. Their families vacationed together. They spent holidays and nights at one another's homes. When Gilbert's father died, Landon's importance in her emotional life deepened. Gilbert was 11 when her father died, 2 years into the series. At home, she later said, grief was not discussed freely. Adults on the production were told not to raise the subject with her. Whatever the intention, the regular schedule continued. The set gave Gilbert somewhere to use feelings that did not have an easy place elsewhere. Little House required crying with unusual frequency. She had to run and cry, listen and cry, or stand inside another character's loss until emotion became visible on cue. One day, Gilbert struggled to reach what a scene required. Landon stopped the work and asked her to walk with him. About 20 feet from the set, he knelt in front of her with tears on his own face and asked whether she knew how much he loved her. Gilbert began to cry. Landon told her she was ready, and they returned to the scene. As an adult, Gilbert could see the manipulation in the method. She also said she did not remember it as harmful. Landon understood what would unlock the performance that day, and the child felt cared for rather than used. The memory explains, without excusing every later judgment, why relational warmth mattered so much in Gilbert's account of work. The set was not merely where she demonstrated technique. It was where adults noticed her feelings, where grief could become action, and where affection sometimes arrived through the process of acting. Anderson described learning through concentrated work. Gilbert recalled Landon sometimes using personal affection to unlock a performance. Both approaches served the production. Whatever their cause, the girls still did not become close. The two girls, therefore, did not simply have different personalities. They occupied different relationships to the most powerful person on the production. Anderson learned that disciplined work could earn his difficult material. Gilbert experienced him as boss, mentor, and a form of family. Neither girl could see the whole arrangement from the other's position, There was also a more vulnerable side to Anderson's seriousness. During the first years of the series, a proposed tabloid story frightened her. She could not later remember with certainty which publication had threatened it, though she thought of a paper such as the National Enquirer. Her mother contacted a producer. The producer contacted Landon. That night, Landon telephoned Anderson at home. He promised to protect her by flooding the outlet with positive stories. Anderson remembered that reassurance as exactly what she needed to hear. The episode does not tell us whether any campaign was necessary or what eventually happened to the proposed story. It tells us what frightened the child. A headline suggesting bad behaviour felt dangerous enough that adults mobilised around it. Anderson wanted to be known as dependable, and she feared the public version of her becoming something she could not control. That fear would matter later, when stories about the two girls became larger than anything they had said to each other. By 1977, Anderson's life showed how quickly a child performer could acquire adult responsibilities without adult freedom. She was 15. During production, part of her schooling took place at the studio. Otherwise, she attended a parochial high school in Burbank. Some classmates asked how much she earned. Anderson refused the question, having decided the information did not belong to the public. She could account for the deductions. A portion of her pay went into a trust fund. Another portion went to her agent. She also helped support a fan club with about 1,500 members. Membership payments did not cover every letter, bulletin, or Christmas card, and she understood the additional expense as part of publicity. Yet her daily spending remained controlled. She received an allowance. If she wanted extra money for something her mother did not consider necessary, she babysat. A television salary could attract questions at school, while ordinary spending still depended on an allowance, or 75 cents earned in an hour of babysitting. Public attention reached beyond money. Crew members watched closely when a boy visited the set and offered their judgments about him. Anderson also said she preferred not to date boys in show business because people talked and magazines could print things that were not true. She did not want to give rumour an easier beginning. She said acting was what she wanted and recognised the value of a steady series. Wanting the profession did not mean surrendering every boundary around it. The distinction is useful because reserve is often interpreted as absence. In Anderson's case, reserve could be active management. She answered one kind of question and closed another. She fulfilled fan club obligations while trying to limit gossip. She earned adult money and protected the amount from classmates. She worked in public while keeping parts of the work private. That pattern would later shape the historical record. A boundary maintained at 15 leaves fewer casual stories behind. The missing material can look like emptiness, although it may be the surviving outline of a decision. For now, the production rewarded Anderson. The work became harder. Mary moved from responsible daughter to a young woman capable of carrying episodes. At the same time, Laura remained the character through whom audiences most often entered the family. Gilbert's quick reactions, humour, defiance, and vulnerability made her inseparable from the show's emotional centre. The actresses were not fighting for one identical role. Anderson received proof that she could hold difficult drama. Gilbert occupied a place in the series no other performer could take. The distinction allowed both to succeed, but it also created two different kinds of attention. In the fourth season, those kinds of attention came into their sharpest contrast. Mary was going blind. Anderson knew the event belonged to the historical Mary Ingalls, but knowing that did not make the television decision feel safe. A permanent disability could give an actress one extraordinary story and then remove the ordinary actions a series knew how to write. Anderson raised the concern with Landon. She remembered him asking her to trust him. Then she went to the Foundation for the Junior Blind in Los Angeles to learn what the script could not teach. The important word was recent. Anderson was not studying how a person who had lived without sight for years moved through familiar space. Mary would be newly blind. Her habits would still belong to someone who expected to see. The instructor showed Anderson how that transition affected the body. She learned to shuffle at first, rather than stride with confidence. She practiced extending a hand before her. She learned the coordination of a cane sweeping across the ground as her feet moved. She practiced finding a chair with her hand and lowering herself, only when she knew where the seat was. She learned a method for gauging the water rising inside a glass. Back on the set, a different discipline began. Crew members could move through Anderson's field of vision while she was playing Mary, and her eyes could not acknowledge them. Exterior sunlight invited a squint. Arc lights created their own physical demand. Anderson had to let visual information reach her and then prevent her body from answering it. The technique was not a fixed blank stare. The story began with fear and disorientation. Later episodes required greater competence. Anderson had to remember how long Mary had been blind at each point and adjust what the character could do. On March 6th and 13th of 1978, NBC broadcast the two parts of I'll Be Waving As You Drive Away. Mary struggles as her vision fails and panics when darkness becomes complete. She is sent to a school where she begins to rebuild an independent life. The episodes gave Anderson the material she had once wanted. Not another calm reaction beside someone else's story, but a sustained transformation. The performance brought the only acting Emmy nomination received for work on Little House during its original run. That sentence can sound like a piece of trivia. Anderson's memories restore the human scale. She was placed in the lead actress in a drama series category, with established adult performers. She attended the September ceremony in a designer dress. She did not expect to win. Anderson remembered Landon telling her that she would not, then offering his theory about voting patterns between the coasts. Sayeda Thompson received the award. The nomination was announced on August 10th, the same day Anderson graduated from high school at 15. The coincidence compressed two measures of accelerated childhood into one date. The set tutor and shortened school life produced a diploma. The work arranged around those lessons placed her beside leading adult actresses. Neither event made her socially older than she was. They made adult expectations official. Years earlier, at an IHOP near Toluca Lake, Michael Landon had invited the young Anderson to join her family for breakfast. Landon would later share the 1978 nominee list with Anderson. The earlier kindness remained one of the details Anderson carried. Even the manicure became part of the collision between adolescent life and Prairie work. For the Emmy ceremony, Anderson wore her nails long. Production permitted her to keep them during filming, although she later thought the choice was generous to the teenager and wrong for Mary Ingalls. She was still young enough for a dress and fingernails to make the evening tangible. She was accomplished enough to stand in a leading actress category. The primetime Emmy nomination showed that Anderson could hold adult dramatic material while still a teenager. By the summer of 1979, recognition was also carrying her farther from the weekly set. On July 1st, Spanish television featured Anderson on the program 625 Linneas. The appearance placed her before an international audience as herself, without the whole Ingalls household around her. The attention was becoming stranger at home. A 1979 profile found Anderson discovering that the blindness story had changed how people recognized her. Before the episodes were filmed, she had worried that making Mary blind might be a graceful way to remove the character. After the broadcast, more strangers recognized the actress than before. Some had absorbed the performance so completely that they believed Anderson herself could not see. The misunderstanding was flattering as evidence of the work and unsettling as evidence of how quickly a character could replace the person playing her. Anderson had trained her eyes not to respond. The success of that control now followed her into places where she could see perfectly well. Public events required the opposite skill. At an NBC affiliates dinner, Anderson noticed James Garner across the room. She admired his work and wanted to meet him, but approaching a famous adult without a role or introduction demanded a kind of confidence she did not naturally possess. She crossed the room anyway. The encounter was brief. Anderson introduced herself and later remembered Garner as warm and encouraging. Nothing about it changed a contract or produced a role. Its importance lies in the action. The teenager, often described as aloof, had seen someone she respected, moved through her own shyness and made contact. The same profile asked what she wanted beyond acting. Anderson said directing interested her, but she did not want the title merely as a novelty granted to a young performer. She wanted to direct only when she could be more than average. That standard contained both ambition and delay. She was already studying how scenes were made, already naming a position of authority, and already insisting that desire alone did not qualify her to hold it. The child who learned by watching adults could imagine becoming one of the adults who shaped the finished work. For the moment, however, the public knew her through a role so persuasive that strangers believed its blindness belonged to her. Recognition was widening at the same time identity was becoming harder to separate from Mary. The next important test did not ask Anderson to carry Mary through another tragedy. It removed Walnut Grove entirely. ABC broadcast Which Mother Is Mine on September 26, 1979, Anderson's 17th birthday. Anderson played Alexandria Benton, a 16-year-old settled in a foster home when the mother who had given her up returned, sober and asking to reclaim her. Every possible answer would injure someone. The role depended on divided feeling. Anger could not erase the girl's recognition of her mother's vulnerability. Love for the foster family could not make the first abandonment unreal. A court could provide a legal decision, but Anderson still had to make the audience believe that the child at the centre was thinking, rather than merely waiting for adults to decide her life. A contemporary review called the drama absorbing, and Anderson's performance touchingly detailed. The work lived in a girl's effort to judge adults whose needs did not fit neatly together. In March of 1980, the Spanish magazine TP named Anderson Best Foreign Actress at its television awards for her Little House work. The earlier television appearance did not cause the award. Together, the events showed that her individual recognition had become international. Later that year, Which Mother Is Mine received a daytime Emmy for Anderson's individual achievement as a performer in children's programming. The record establishes the award. It does not require an invented ceremony scene or a speech no source preserves. Its professional meaning is enough. Anderson had already been nominated in prime time for the story in which Mary lost her sight. Now an outside production had placed her at the centre, and this time the recognition ended in a win. The achievement weakened any assumption that Mary Ingalls was the only form in which the industry could understand her. Recognition did not settle what Anderson should do next. It made the choice more immediate. She could carry difficult material. She could lead a production beyond Walnut Grove. The remaining question was whether future opportunities would let her grow, or simply trade one fixed image for another. Gilbert's outside opportunities did not begin with a 14-year-old calmly designing a production empire. Her mother changed managers and took her to meet Raymond Katz. Katz asked what roles the family wanted to pursue. Gilbert and her mother named Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker. Gilbert wanted a role different from Laura. Katz was the adult who turned the wish into a package, helped establish Half Pint Productions, and carried the idea to the network. A contemporary account said the network first refused and later agreed. Gilbert's own later account was equally careful about the balance of power. The company carried her childhood nickname, but she did not pretend that she had functioned as an experienced producer at 14. Her mother and manager made the early business decisions. Gilbert's responsibility was the role, and for a time even that appeared to be in danger. Near the end of rehearsals in Los Angeles, the director and producers told Gilbert's mother that the performance was not working. Gilbert was moving through the part without discovering how a child who could neither see nor hear would occupy space. Imagination, which had served her so easily as Laura, had stopped at a boundary she did not know how to cross. Her mother took her back to acting teacher Jeff Corey in Malibu. Corey darkened the room, covered Gilbert's eyes, blocked her hearing, and moved the furniture. For roughly 3 hours, he deprived her of the two senses on which she'd been relying and forced her to discover the room through touch. He pushed and redirected her while reminding her to remember the fear of leaving a place she knew for one she could not see ahead of her. The session gave Gilbert a physical answer. One hand remained behind to preserve contact with the place she'd just left. The other reached forward to test what was coming. On the television set, she carried the idea into the environment. She asked whether the walls and stair rails could be marked with smudges at the height where Helen's hands would repeatedly pass. The marks would show a history of touch, even when the character said nothing. The Palm Beach stage production came first. Gilbert had never performed a play. On opening night, she ran toward the audience and stopped near the stage edge. People in the first rows rose as if they needed to catch her. Their movement told her that they believed the blindness. The play extended its run, giving her command of the role before filming began. This work created an illuminating parallel with Anderson, without turning their careers into a contest. Anderson had visited a foundation and studied how blindness changed over time before Mary lost her sight in 1978. Gilbert entered a darkened workshop and built Helen Keller through a different form of sensory training the following year. Both girls were required to replace the ordinary reflexes of sight with deliberate physical behaviour. Both received Emmy nominations before adulthood. The recognition reached Gilbert in 1980. Her mother answered the nomination call. Gilbert's first excitement changed as the other names in the category were read. Patty Duke, who had played Helen Keller years earlier and now played Annie Sullivan beside her, was nominated too. So was Bette Davis. Gilbert remembered becoming embarrassed by the possibility that she might somehow win over women whose work already belonged to television history. This ceremony took place during an actors' strike. Gilbert did not attend. She watched from home in the gown that had been prepared for the evening. Patty Duke won the acting category. The Miracle Worker won as the year's outstanding drama or comedy special. Gilbert later joked that the programme award technically made her an Emmy-winning executive producer, then corrected the impression. When the company was formed at about 14, she had not performed the producing labour the credit suggested. Real authority came gradually through later projects. At the beginning, Half Pint Productions was an adult structure built around a child's opportunity. That distinction changes the comparison with Anderson. From across the set, an outside film could look like proof that Gilbert was being offered a wider future while Mary was being narrowed by repeated suffering. The opportunity was real. So were the adults who negotiated it, the network that had to be persuaded, the rehearsal failure that almost defeated it, and the physical work Gilbert used to recover. Neither actress received achievement in a simple form. Anderson's great recognition opened Mary's blindness story and helped trap the character inside catastrophe. Gilbert's outside nomination widened her range while strengthening the public idea that every door opened more easily for Half Pint. The girls could not see the complete machinery around each other's success. Much of it remained in rooms where children were not making the final decisions. Gilbert later described these outside productions as an education in more than acting. She watched Landon, producer Kent McRae, and every department around them. She learned what the wranglers, greens crew, and craft service workers did. When her own productions began, members of the Little House crew came with her. Before the series ended, the actress known as a spontaneous child on camera was also learning how to produce. This is where the simple contrast between a serious Anderson and a playful Gilbert breaks down. Gilbert's playfulness did not prevent ambition. Anderson's reserve did not make her the only child who treated the set as a school. Both girls were building adult skills. What differed was the route and the visibility of the reward. Gilbert's centrality carried a pressure that did not look like pressure from Anderson's side of the set. As Laura grew toward marriage, the production introduced Dean Butler as Almanzo Wilder. Gilbert had expected an actor closer to her own age. She was 14 or 15, still wearing braces and seeing herself as a tomboy. Butler was an adult man who shaved and drove a car. Gilbert liked him. She had time to know him before the scripts required the first kiss and marriage. Her later discomfort was not an accusation that Butler had behaved improperly. It concerned the adult system that treated the romantic turn as the next ordinary step in Laura's story. No one, Gilbert remembered, asked whether she felt ready. The production did not have the modern language or the intimacy coordinators that would now surround a young performer entering romantic material with an adult scene partner. The episodes arrived, wardrobe and blocking followed, and the child at the centre was expected to make the transition believable. That expectation complicates the idea that Laura's better material represented uncomplicated freedom. Gilbert received the continuing story, more screen time, and the romance viewers anticipated from the books. She also had to grow on the production schedule. A character's age could move forward in a script faster than the actress's private readiness. The comparison with Anderson becomes clearer here. Mary's stories narrowed into repeated catastrophe, leading Anderson to ask why she was still present. Laura's stories expanded into adult life, leading Gilbert into scenes for which no one had asked whether she felt prepared. One actress faced contraction, the other faced acceleration. Neither condition can be reduced to who had the better part. Opportunity and control were not the same thing. The television image hid the unevenness. Laura could appear certain of her love for Almanzo because Gilbert did the work required to make that certainty visible. Away from the finished episode, the actress remained a teenager, learning how much of herself a continuing character might ask her to outgrow. At first, the blindness story opened a new world. Over time, the world contracted. Mary married Adam Kendall and helped teach blind children. Yet the series repeatedly returned to suffering as the surest way to use Anderson's dramatic ability. Mary endured a miscarriage. A fire killed her baby. She experienced illness and psychological collapse. A character once defined by competence increasingly arrived when the story needed catastrophe. Anderson later described the practical frustration of sustaining blindness over several seasons. Writers placed Mary in situations where, by Anderson's judgment, the character would not logically have been present. Leaving her out might make viewers think she had disappeared. Including her could reduce her to a reminder. She remembered one circus scene near the end of her regular run. Anderson could not later identify every episode detail with certainty. She believed Adam may have been beside Mary. Charles explained what was happening, and Anderson stood there thinking that her character's only purpose was to show the audience she was still alive. That was not a quarrel with Gilbert. It was a judgment about the work. The distinction matters because the girls' careers were becoming a public comparison before either had finished adolescence. A reporter could see Gilbert receiving attractive outside roles, and Anderson tiring of Mary's limitations. From there, it was easy to translate dissatisfaction with a role into resentment of the person whose opportunities looked freer. Some resentment did exist. Anderson later acknowledged it. But the chronology shows what the feeling attached to: the distribution of screen time, public affection, and possibility. Anderson's effort to avoid being fixed as Mary had begun before she reduced her Little House role. The series occupied about 8 months of each year. During the remaining time, when other young performers could return to ordinary school, Anderson often looked for another set. Not every opportunity was acceptable simply because it was different. According to Anderson's memoir, she was asked to play the central role that later went to Brooke Shields in The Blue Lagoon. The nudity made her uncomfortable, and she remained bound by a morals clause in her NBC contract. She declined. Later, after the finished film had become famous, Anderson said she did not regret the decision. She thought Shields had been beautiful in the setting. She also thought the role had not been right for her. That answer was narrower than a rejection of every adult subject. Anderson said she was not declaring that she would never consider nudity if a future part required it. The decision belonged to that project at that age under that contract. It was a boundary rather than a retreat. She set another boundary with her manager. Anderson remembered telling him that she did not want more teen roles and did not want posters designed to sell her as an idol. She had already played older. Going backward into a manufactured adolescent image offered a different kind of confinement. Then, in the spring of 1980, came a project that seemed to break the pattern. Happy Birthday to Me would be Anderson's first starring feature for Columbia Pictures, directed by J. Lee Thompson. It placed her at an elite school surrounded by violent deaths and damaged memory. Anderson chose it in part because she'd been using every hiatus to resist typecasting, especially after blindness became Mary's defining condition. The production went to Montreal. Cast member Tracy Bregman later remembered that she and Anderson were there for 10 weeks. Other young actors came and went more quickly, while Anderson worked every day and had little downtime. Little House remained present even in the planning. Anderson later explained that scheduling was easier because Mary appeared in fewer episodes that season, and most of her Prairie work could be arranged after the film. For a while, the choice appeared exact. Anderson was not merely escaping a wholesome image by selecting something shocking. She had chosen a script in which her character, Ginny, was meant to be the murderer. The ending would force the audience to reconsider the young woman it had followed through the entire film. Anderson later said the ending changed halfway through production. Anderson later said the original script had been very good and that she wished the change had not been made. Bregman independently remembered the reversal. She had already filmed her character's death when she learned that the rewritten solution would make her character responsible and use a disguised identity to explain what the audience had seen. The change required a practical disguise. A plaster cast was made from Anderson's face so a latex mask could reproduce Ginny's appearance. The young actress had selected a part partly because it disrupted expectations attached to her. While the film was being made, the production changed the final meaning of the character she had agreed to play. Leaving the familiar authority of Landon did not mean entering a world where a young actress controlled every creative choice. It gave Anderson access to different material. It did not give her ownership of the finished story. She kept testing the boundary anyway. During the same period, Anderson starred opposite the Waltons performer Mary McDonough in the supernatural television film Midnight Offerings. The production schedule shows how deliberately Anderson was fitting outside identities around Little House. McDonough later recalled that Anderson worked the first 10 days and then returned to the Prairie series, while Midnight Offerings continued for several more weeks. McDonough's wording was an estimate, but the shape of the arrangement is clear. Anderson's work had been compressed so one television life could fit inside the demands of another. She passed on a role that did not fit, accepted a break from type whose ending changed beneath her, and packed a third character into a narrow opening in Mary Ingalls' schedule. She was testing what freedom might look like before the secure job had ended. The tests also clarify why Mary's shrinking possibilities became so difficult to accept. Anderson had already seen that audiences and producers could follow her somewhere else. The Prairie was no longer the only place where she could work. It was simply the place that still controlled most of her calendar. During the shared working years, Anderson's ordinary day left little room for the social life people imagined around a successful young cast. A near-contemporary profile followed her through repeated takes on an old railroad car set and into the studio commissary, where she ate lunch in a bonnet-era costume and high-button shoes. In one school year, she said, she had attended a regular campus only 19 days. The rest of her education took place with a tutor around filming. She generally arrived at about 8 in the morning. Lines were learned before sleep. Fan mail was handled with the help of twin friends who did not work on the show. When Anderson and her family left the studio, they tried to leave show business there. That private boundary separated her not only from Gilbert, but from the machinery making her famous. It gave Anderson a world in which Mary Ingalls did not have to occupy every room. Fame entered anyway. Anderson's parents divorced while Little House was still shaping her adolescence. Tutoring had already reduced her time among ordinary classmates. She described herself as frightened of social situations with people her own age. When she attended a prom, other students surrounded her for autographs. She returned home in tears. The event should not be turned into a diagnosis. It explained something more limited and more useful. The behaviour that looked like withdrawal on a set also existed in places where Gilbert was nowhere near her. Public attention could make ordinary social practice difficult. Keeping control of work did not mean Anderson felt in control everywhere else. Gilbert lived with childhood fame differently. The set connected her to Landon's family, to Arngrim, to crew members, and to a sense of belonging she continued to describe warmly. She could be confident there and still feel insecure beside Anderson. In later recollection, Gilbert saw Anderson as elegant and pretty. She saw herself as buck-toothed and awkward. The older girl's blue eyes and composure became part of the authority Gilbert felt from her. Admiration sat beside irritation long before Gilbert publicly recognized both. Anderson saw a different advantage. Gilbert had the freckles, the crooked teeth, and the warmth viewers adored. In a 1998 interview, Anderson joked that Gilbert had landed a toothpaste commercial despite those crooked teeth, while Anderson's straight teeth brought her no such reward. The humour exposes the imbalance as Anderson experienced it. She could prepare a performance, but she could not prepare to become the audience's sweetheart. Gilbert could hold that status without feeling as polished as the older girl she watched. Each saw an advantage in the other, while also describing costs the other could not see. By June of 1981, Anderson was 18 and ready to reduce her role. People Weekly described the girls as having something close to sibling rivalry. The profile connected increased friction to Gilbert's outside opportunities and Anderson's confinement inside Mary's tragedies. The reporter's label travelled farther than Anderson's careful distinctions. In her own words, Anderson called herself calculating, self-sufficient and reserved. She said she enjoyed being alone. Staying detached, she explained, was the only way she knew to work with people so closely for so long without arguments. Then she rejected the simplest interpretation. She was not angry. She took her career seriously. The word calculating can sound sinister when lifted from the sentence around it. In context, Anderson was describing a young woman planning her professional future. Mary's stories felt exhausted. Anderson had already worked in television, films, a feature and theatre. She believed the time to move was while other possibilities remained. Distance was her method. To Gilbert, it had a cost. The women agree on the result even when their explanations differ. They completed years of effective work. They did not become friends. Gilbert remembered a missing sisterly kinship and specific moments of hurt. Anderson remembered focusing on the job and maintaining separation. One account contains grievance, the other contains a boundary. Then a newspaper supplied the rupture neither account had established. The report said Anderson was leaving because of a long-simmering conflict with Gilbert. It described mutual jealousy and a major blow-up. Alison Arngrim's departure was folded into the same dramatic package. The story took real ingredients, different personalities, career comparison, two performers leaving regular work, and invented a single combustible cause. Anderson answered while the series was still in production. On September 3, 1981, United Press International published an interview in which her indignation was visible even in the reporter's description. Anderson denied a big blow-up with Gilbert and Arngrim. She explained that Arngrim had a contract disagreement. Her own reason was that the writers had exhausted the possibilities for Mary. She listed what the character had endured: blindness, miscarriage, mental collapse, a baby lost in a fire and repeated disease. She had done, she believed, about everything she could with the part. Then Anderson addressed the jealousy story directly. Rumours had said for years that she and Gilbert disliked one another. Some said Anderson was jealous, others said Gilbert was. Anderson denied both claims as the reason for what was happening. Her response did not end with a public statement. Anderson telephoned Gilbert. According to Anderson's contemporary account, the two got together to discuss what had been printed. They laughed at the story, then agreed that it was not truly funny because it had hurt them both. No source establishes the room, the day, or the dialogue beyond Anderson's summary. Gilbert did not leave a located, independent account of the meeting. Those limits should remain. Even within them, the action is clear. Anderson read a story turning their distance into open war, called the person placed opposite her in it, and sought direct contact. By Anderson's account, Gilbert agreed to meet. For that moment, the women occupied the same side. Anderson was being portrayed as fleeing because of hostility. Gilbert was being written into a jealous conflict she had not publicly declared. Both had a professional history reduced to a feud plot. The meeting corrected the claim without creating intimacy. They could laugh together and remain fundamentally distant. They could recognize a shared injury without knowing how to discuss every older one. This was not yet reconciliation. It was the first documented example of outside pressure making direct conversation more useful than silence. The result changed one thing and left another untouched. The reported blow-up lost credibility. The private absence of friendship remained. Anderson stopped appearing as a regular after the 7th season, but daily work did not end with a theatrical slam door. She returned for 3 season 8 episodes. 2 were parts of the reincarnation of Nellie. The last, broadcast on December 21st, 1981, was A Christmas They Never Forgot. The first 2 returns opened the season on October 5th and 12th. Mary and Adam's story was not left hanging at the edge of town. The blind school had come under state control. Adam accepted work connected to his late father's law firm, and the couple prepared to move to New York. The episodes gave Mary a destination beyond the suffering that had narrowed Anderson's patience with the role. That exit also changed the family geography. Laura remained in the expanding Walnut Grove story. Mary moved east with a husband and a profession beside her. For the actresses, the production was doing openly what their lives were already doing, placing the sisters on separate roads while preserving a reason for one more return. The setting gave their final regular-era image a quiet irony. A blizzard keeps members of the growing Ingalls family inside the little house on Christmas Eve. Mary is back. Laura is there. Around the table and fire, the characters tell stories of Christmases past. The episode depends less on action than on listening. The storm closes the road, the house fills, and one memory makes room for another. Anderson and Gilbert no longer had to manufacture the intimacy of girls sharing a bed. They played adult sisters inside a larger family, present while parents and children turned older, Christmases into spoken stories. Only months after a newspaper had announced a major rupture, Anderson and Gilbert were again performing family memory in the same crowded room. The episode did not mean the actresses had repaired their relationship. It showed something more precise. Anderson's professional decision had not made shared work impossible. The 2 women could return to the same marks, listen for cues, and make Mary and Laura believable until Anderson's guest appearances were complete. When the production day ended, however, no future call sheet required them to come back together. For 7 seasons, structure had kept them in one another's lives. Sets, schedules, school hours, scenes, and adults created contact even when friendship did not. Anderson's departure removed that structure. The daily relationship was over. What remained was the memory of it, and memory would prove harder to direct than any episode. The next call sheets made the separation visible. After Anderson's final guest appearances, Little House continued to change. Landon reduced his presence as an actor, and the 9th season was retitled A New Beginning. Gilbert had spent years below Landon and Karen Grassel in the billing order. In 1982, she entered the makeup trailer and saw her name at number 1. Landon's name appeared much farther down because he was present only for the departure story. Gilbert remembered reacting with delight. Landon came up behind her, took the sheet, turned it around, and reduced the moment to a challenge. If she could not carry the series from the top, their positions could be reversed. The exchange was affectionate, but the risk was real. The production was asking whether the children who had grown inside Landon's structure could sustain what remained after he stepped away. Gilbert accepted the burden. For the following season, Laura was no longer only the audience's way into Parr's family. The actress who had entered at 9 became the formal first name on the working day. The promotion came after Mary had moved to New York and Anderson had stopped returning. It therefore did not create the childhood imbalance between the girls. It made the later professional state explicit. Gilbert became number 1 only when the original family arrangement had already dissolved. That sequence matters because later memory can flatten every season into one permanent hierarchy. During the shared years, Landon remained the authority, Grassel played the mother, Gilbert carried the point of view, and Anderson earned major dramatic showcases. In 1982, the arrangement changed. Gilbert inherited a production whose most familiar relationships were disappearing and whose stories were beginning to repeat themselves. Number 1 on the call sheet meant centrality. It also meant being present for the decline that Anderson had already chosen to leave. In January of 1983, Anderson gave an interview that captured her view of herself before reunion culture fixed familiar labels around the cast. She knew people found her shy. She said she stayed quiet when she had nothing useful to add and listened because listening helped her learn. Her feelings were easily hurt, but she preferred sensitivity to becoming cold. Professional criticism was different. People could be honest about the work, and she believed she knew her business. The distinction mattered. Anderson was resisting the word cold only 2 years after leaving Little House. She described silence as attention, not superiority, and sensitivity as something she managed rather than proof of weakness. A 6-week stage run tested that claim. Anderson applied her own makeup. She entered the same dressing room and prepared to say the same words again, night after night. No editor could alter the rhythm afterward. No second take waited if a moment failed. At first, the repetition depressed her. There were evenings when she sat in the dressing room and dreaded going before a live audience. The feeling tested the image of the composed professional in a new way. On a television set, concentration could narrow the world to a mark, a lens, and a scene that would eventually end. In the theatre, tomorrow promised the same sequence again. Some audiences made the work harder. Anderson remembered nights when people seemed to offer almost nothing back. They did not laugh. They did not applaud. From the stage, their stillness could feel less like attention than absence. Yet the evening still had to continue. Anderson adapted. The dread did not vanish, but it became less intense. Once she entered the performance, the work could feel comparatively easy, and making people laugh brought a pleasure television drama had rarely asked her to discover. A quiet audience might leave her discouraged for a time. It did not prevent her from returning. Her conclusion was not that stage work had cured shyness. She remained shy. She no longer accepted that shyness meant weakness. The 6-week run shows that leaving did not lead at once into privacy or family life. Anderson first stepped into a medium where control was more exposed, repetition more visible, and response immediate. She tested the career she said she wanted and found both exhaustion and enjoyment inside it. The result was not a triumphant conversion to theatre. It was more useful than that. Anderson learned that a new form of work could make her miserable before the curtain and still become pleasurable once she began. Moving on did not require every new room to feel natural. It required her to enter the room again. Gilbert remained publicly identified with the Little House as Laura's story continued through marriage and motherhood. Anderson continued acting too, then married writer and producer Michael Sloan and drew a firmer border around family life. She later said she kept a low profile so celebrity mania would not become her children's childhood. Gilbert received a kind of ending that Anderson's departure had not provided. The regular series disappeared from NBC's next full schedule without anyone first giving Gilbert a formal final conversation. Victor French telephoned and mentioned protesting the cancellation. Gilbert did not initially understand what he meant. Her representatives contacted Landon, and the production secured 3 television movies that allowed the cast to return once more. The last one filmed required Walnut Grove to destroy itself. A landowner claims the town, and the residents choose to leave him buildings he cannot use. For the production, the fiction solved a practical problem as well. The structures at Big Sky Ranch could not simply remain available for someone else's version of the town. Explosives were placed. The buildings were brought down. The destruction was filmed before the actors' final reactions. Gilbert remembered walking toward the set with the others the following day. They rounded the familiar approach and found rubble where the working town had stood. These were not merely facades she had crossed during scenes. They were the boundaries of her childhood workplace. She had rested there on hot days, learned to ride nearby, played hide-and-seek, waited for cues, and moved through years in which Laura grew older whenever wardrobe and script required it. The group tried to work. One person would begin crying and the feeling would pass through the others. They stopped, held one another, recovered, and began again. The production had removed the possibility of an ordinary return. At the end of the day, Gilbert went back for one more look. She found Landon standing alone among what remained. He put an arm around her. Gilbert told him she was frightened. She remembered him assuring her that for her this was only the beginning. Then they walked back toward the cars and trailers together. The scene closes one part of Gilbert's archive. Her relationship with Little House began with Landon choosing her through an emotional test, and his daughter revealing the decision before the network called. It ended with Landon beside her, in a town they could no longer enter. Anderson's ending had been quieter. She judged that Mary no longer offered growth, returned for limited episodes, and allowed the schedule to stop bringing her back. Gilbert remained until the landscape itself was taken away. The difference helps explain why they carried Little House differently into adult life. Anderson practiced leaving work at the studio. Gilbert built friendships, identity, authority, an emotional family inside the production. One actress chose another life beyond Mary. The other walked through ruins before Walnut Grove became memory. Neither form of departure was betrayal. Each woman left the childhood structure in the way her position required. But when they later spoke about those years, they were not remembering the same final image. The former Screen Sisters no longer had scenes, tutors, or schedules forcing contact. Distance no longer required a decision. It could continue on its own. Yet Little House did not release them. The series remained in circulation. Somewhere Mary and Laura were always meeting for the first time, always leaning toward each other in the Ingalls house, always young. Viewers who had believed the sisterhood naturally wanted the actresses to preserve it. An honest statement that they had not been close felt like damage to something the audience considered its own. That pressure did not make the women's answers false. It made every answer unusually heavy. Near the end of the 1980s, Anderson's professional relationship with Landon changed in a way that the old series could not have predicted. She had read I. Wright Campbell's novel, Where Pigeons Go to Die, and believed it could become a television film. In one account, she recommended it to Landon. Another describes Anderson and her future husband, Michael Sloan, bringing it to him together. The supported result is clear. The project reached Landon through Anderson's initiative, and she became an associate producer. The reversal was quiet but substantial. During Little House, Landon had occupied nearly every position of authority that mattered to a child performer. He was the star, an executive producer, a writer, and a frequent director. Anderson arrived when called, learned the material, and performed the role the production had built for her. With Where Pigeons Go to Die, she returned carrying material. She had helped identify the story and move it toward production. Landon remained the more experienced producer, but Anderson stood beside the project as an adult colleague with a producing credit. The film was made in Kansas and aired on NBC in January 1996. It later received 2 Emmy nominations. Those facts provide a firmer record than any attempt to invent what was said in a development meeting. The credit appeared. The film aired. The institution recognized the work. Their history had not been erased. It had changed direction. The man who once helped determine what Mary Ingalls would suffer on screen now accepted a project Anderson helped place before him. the girl whose most famous character had gradually lost agency returned with a story she had chosen. A production relationship that began with assignment had become, at least for this film, a form of collaboration. In July of 1991, Michael Landon died of pancreatic cancer. Former cast members gathered around the loss. Anderson later said she saw people from Little House at his memorial. Gilbert was also there. At the 40th anniversary reunion years later, Karen Grassel would describe sitting with the 3 television daughters together for the first time since Landon's funeral. The evidence supports a shared gathering. It does not establish a conversation between Anderson and Gilbert. This difference is emotionally important. Grief can bring people into the same room while directing everyone's attention toward the person who is gone. The former cast had lost the man who had been star, producer, frequent writer, director, authority, mentor, and, for Gilbert, something close to another father. Anderson and Gilbert could honour him inside the same community without yet knowing how to address each other. The funeral therefore belongs in their chronology, but not as a secret repair. It proves that later claims of 50 years without any contact cannot be right. It also proves that contact alone was not enough. 7 years later, Anderson allowed a reporter into the adult life she had built. The 1998 People profile found her in Topanga Canyon with her husband and children, enjoying what she called the experience of being a regular person. The article looked backward at the Prairie and asked about the cast. Anderson said it had been a happy set, but one was happy to go home at night. By then, Anderson's working boundary was no longer arranged mainly around Mary Ingalls. It was arranged around 2 children. She lived with her husband, writer and producer Michael Sloan, their 7-year-old daughter Piper, and their 2-year-old son Griffin. Anderson had not announced a permanent retirement. She accepted occasional projects connected to her husband or to friends. The standard was no longer whether a role could break an old image. It was whether the work could fit inside the family life she had chosen. Earthquake in New York met that standard. Sloan was an executive producer, and Anderson's filming required only 6 days. 6 days still felt large from inside the household. Preparing to leave the children with helpers, Anderson wrote instructions for days. Small notes appeared throughout the house. One reminded the adults caring for Griffin to remember his earplugs when he took a bath. The detail has none of the grandeur associated with a return to television. That is why it matters. The actress who had once learned lines before sleep was now trying to transfer the invisible knowledge of a mother's ordinary day onto post-it notes. The shoot did not prove she had lost interest in acting. It showed the terms under which acting could re-enter. A production could be accepted, completed, and folded back into family life, but the household would not be treated as empty space waiting for a career to fill it. When Anderson said it was pleasant to discover what she was like without acting, she was not erasing the child who had loved the work. She was allowing that child's skill to become one part of an adult identity. The 6-day schedule was brief enough to disappear inside a filmography. In the chronology of Anderson's choices, it marks a durable change. Work still mattered. It no longer had first claim on every day. Then she admitted the professional feeling that simplified retellings often inflate. She had sometimes resented Gilbert's extra screen time and sweetheart status. The toothpaste joke followed. Gilbert's freckles and crooked teeth were adorable enough for a commercial, while Anderson's straight teeth had not produced the same opportunity. The admission is narrower than a declaration of personal hatred and more candid than pretending comparison never hurt. It also sits beside the 1981 interview without erasing it. Anderson had denied that mutual jealousy caused a big blow-up and drove her from the series. In 1998, she acknowledged resentment about status and opportunity. Both statements can be true. The profile also noted that Anderson rarely visited castmates and had seen them at Landon's memorial. Her adult life had not become a campaign against Little House. It had become a life in which the old cast was no longer her daily circle. Gilbert carried a different kind of continuity. She spoke about the series more often and in greater emotional detail. The public record gradually filled with her memories, the hierarchy she felt, Anderson's reserve, the fabric slap, the friendship Gilbert found with Arngrim, and the sisterly kinship she did not find with Anderson. The difference in visibility grew from decisions each woman made beyond the relationship. Anderson had children in the 1990s and sharply reduced her acting. In 2010, she described the choice as protection from what she called celebrity mania. She wanted her children to move through ordinary life without the attention she had known at school dances, on sets, and in public places. Neither child wanted an acting career. When her younger son reached 14, Anderson said she was open to working more regularly again. Her withdrawal had therefore not been a rejection of acting itself. It had been a decision about when acting could enter family life and what exposure her children would carry because of it. That choice had a consequence for the Little House story. Years passed in which Anderson was not routinely available for the interviews and events that kept old anecdotes circulating. Privacy created fewer quotations. Fewer quotations gave other people's accounts more room. Gilbert moved toward public responsibility. The production education she'd begun as a teenager eventually led far beyond Half-Pint Productions. She became president of the Screen Actors Guild from 2001 through 2005. In later reflection, she connected that leadership to watching how the Little House crew functioned and learning that every job mattered to the finished work. The former child who had once been called back to the studio schoolroom now represented working actors in a national institution. Public speaking, interviews, advocacy, and collective memory became part of her adult professional life. Little House remained one of the central experiences through which she explained how she learned those responsibilities. Gilbert's union work also took her onto the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO and the California Film Commission. Those positions are not part of the relationship drama, but they show how fully public representation entered her adult identity. She was repeatedly placed in rooms where experience had to be organised, spoken, defended, and made useful to other people. The surviving record of the two girls is uneven, and some of that unevenness was created deliberately. Gilbert grew up in a family already familiar with entertainment publicity. Her grandfather, television writer Harry Crane, had typed the scenes she used for her Little House audition. Decades later, in an oral history interview, Gilbert also recalled a rule he had given her about speaking publicly. Do not begin telling the press that you did not get along with people on a show. The rule must remain inside her recollection. It does not prove what every early interview concealed. It does explain why cheerful publicity cannot be treated as a complete map of private feeling. Harmony was useful to a production. A child could learn that criticism created another story, and that the simplest way to control it was not to start it. Anderson's archive developed differently. As a teenager, she described the costs of publicity, while withholding details she considered private. A detailed memory may preserve something real, but detail can also harden one person's interpretation. A restrained memory may omit important feeling, but omission is not proof that feeling was absent. Early silence may reflect professionalism, family training, uncertainty, or simple privacy. Later disclosure may reflect greater freedom, a changed understanding, or the different demands of a memoir. By the time both women wrote memoirs, disclosure and privacy were not momentary reactions. They had become durable adult practices, built through years of different work and family choices. These paths did not show that Gilbert cared more about the series, or that Anderson cared less. They produced different archives. Gilbert's adult work repeatedly asked her to narrate experience. Anderson's family decision reduced the occasions on which the public could ask. The imbalance became especially important when the subject was their childhood relationship. Gilbert had language for the hurt and a public habit of using it. Anderson had built a habit of limiting disclosure. As articles accumulated, the quantity of Gilbert quotations could look like independent confirmation, even when many stories trace back to the same memoir or filmed recollection. That does not make Gilbert unreliable. It makes counting sources essential. 10 articles repeating the fabric incident remain one remembered event. 10 descriptions of Anderson as aloof do not become 10 witnesses if they originate with the same speaker. Anderson's quieter record had its own limits. Privacy could protect her children and preserve boundaries, but it could not correct every public inference made in her absence. When she eventually returned with a memoir, readers were not approaching an empty page. Gilbert's version had already helped define the question Anderson would be asked. For years, those memories existed in scattered interviews. In 2009, Gilbert gathered her life into Prairie Tale. A memoir gives experience a shape it did not possess while it was unfolding. Gilbert wrote about a childhood in which television family feeling sometimes answered needs that private life did not. She described the love and safety she associated with Landon. She also wrote that Anderson was difficult to get along with and that the actresses never formed a genuine sisterly bond. Gilbert's account was direct evidence of Gilbert's experience. The distinction sounds simple, yet it was often removed in repetition. An article summarized the book. Another article summarized the summary. Gilbert remembered Anderson as cold gradually became Anderson was cold. The verb identifying whose memory was speaking disappeared. The memoir did not invent the lack of friendship. Anderson would confirm that part. What it did was give the absence emotional texture. Gilbert had wanted or expected something she did not receive. The older girl's distance became an active feature of Gilbert's childhood story. Anderson's 2010 book took another form. When she was approached about writing The Way I See It, her first thought was that the request belonged to someone else. Her husband was the writer in the family. Anderson was the person who had lived the material. At first, she doubted that living it meant she could turn it into a book. Only after being persuaded did she begin to arrange the years in her own hand. That phrase was literal. Anderson wrote in longhand. She carried the pages to piano lessons and onto airplane flights, and her husband transcribed them. The method recalled Landon, who had written scripts by hand, while allowing the work to be paused and resumed around family life. She wrote from memory rather than from a childhood diary. Anderson acknowledged that some scenes had vanished from her recollection. When she did not remember filming something, she allowed the gap to remain. She also returned to old episodes, watching the work again with the eye of the performer she had been. The book leaned toward production. Episodes became structures through which Anderson remembered actors, crew members, physical problems and decisions. She did not offer a matching emotional account of Gilbert because she did not remember that relationship as the centre of her Little House years. Readers who expected a counterattack found very little. Even the writing schedule preserved the tension between work and home. At Christmas, Anderson wanted to decorate and enter the season with her family. A chapter remained unfinished. She made herself complete it first, then emerged with only 4 or 5 days left to turn toward the holiday. The interval was not described as a publisher's ultimatum. It was a private deadline created by the order in which Anderson believed the tasks had to be done. The old working habit was still present. Finish the required material, then go home. Publishing the book asked for something more difficult than finishing pages. Anderson had spent years outside the usual cycle of cast publicity. Now she faced a month of signings, radio appearances and television interviews in which strangers would ask her to recover a childhood they felt they knew. Before leaving, she admitted apprehension. The tour was a new kind of performance, except that no character stood between the audience and the person answering. The woman who had once said it was easier to play a part than to present an award would now sit beneath her own name and explain what the work had meant. Later, Anderson separated the outcome into 2 truths. Professionally, the tour had been good. Personally, it had been hard. The repeated packing and unpacking wore on her. The month felt extremely lonely. That loneliness was not a hidden statement about Gilbert or the old cast. It was the cost Anderson described for becoming publicly available again. The contrast helps explain the form of the memoir without declaring one form of disclosure better than another. Gilbert had written toward private pain and the emotional family she associated with Little House. Anderson wrote toward labour, episodes and the adults from whom she learned. One brought the reader into the wound left by a relationship that never formed. The other brought the reader onto a set where professional memory remained more vivid than intimacy. Anderson's longhand pages did not settle the difference. They gave her a separate place inside the record. Writing the book made memory into work again. Recalled during piano lessons, finished before Christmas decorations, transcribed at home, and carried through a month of travel and interviews. The public result looked like a return to Little House. The private process was an adult deciding how much of that house she could open. When Anderson discussed leaving, her language became sharper than the polite phrase limited material. She joked that Mary had become blind and boring. Either the character stood without much to do, or another tragedy arrived. The stories, Anderson said, had become too much like a soap opera. The action behind those words was a professional refusal. Anderson watched the scripts, judged the role's direction, reduced her participation, and accepted the risk of moving on. Gilbert's presence may have formed part of the comparison surrounding that choice, but Anderson consistently located the decision in Mary's diminishing possibilities. Anderson later explained that choice from several angles. To the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, she said the two had not been friends. She honestly did not have many memories of them together. They had been very, very different. In a separate book tour interview, Anderson said she had deliberately avoided reading Gilbert's memoir before finishing her own, because she did not want another person's account to colour what she wrote. She believed she and Gilbert had worked together without serious problems. She recalled that the young cast had not been encouraged to become extremely close. Her sense of belonging, she added, often rested with the crew. That June, at a Borders in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighbourhood, Anderson sat for another interview before signing copies of the book. The setting placed her inside the public return she had once resisted. A former child actor discussing Little House with readers who had carried Mary into their own adulthood. Anderson described the age gap from her side. Gilbert was almost 2 years younger, and in childhood that felt much larger. Gilbert, she recalled, completed the work and then wanted to play. Anderson watched the adults. She wanted to learn how the craft was done because she hoped to continue doing it. Her wording contained an important uncertainty. Anderson said she never knew whether Gilbert wanted the same lifelong path at that age. She could describe the behaviour she observed. She could not know the younger girl's private ambition. The answer gives Anderson a point of view without making it final. Gilbert's later history shows considerable ambition. The teenage production company, outside films, and decades of work. Anderson's childhood impression was incomplete. Gilbert's impression that reserve meant personal rejection may also have been incomplete. The Chicago interview therefore preserved the same relationship in miniature. Each girl had judged a visible style before she could see the work happening underneath it. Anderson also spoke about Landon as an education. She continued seeking his advice as an adult. She remembered wanting to absorb as much as possible, and she believed he recognized that appetite. When she wrote The Way I See It, she wanted to acknowledge the crew members whose labour had built the world in which she learned. That choice explains why her memoir looks toward episodes and production, rather than toward a detailed account of Gilbert. It does not prove the relationship contained no pain. It shows where Anderson placed the centre of her own Little House story. The answers reveal a striking mismatch. Gilbert remembered the failure of closeness as a wound with incidents attached. Anderson remembered the relationship as too slight to occupy much space. Gilbert remembered the absence vividly. Anderson remembered very little relationship. The record does not establish why their memories gave that absence different weight. Neither account requires a hidden friendship, and neither automatically proves every judgment made about the other. Anderson's book also reflected a decision about disclosure. In 2024, she said she had initially resisted writing it. When she agreed, she did not want to produce a tell-all that picked people apart simply because scandal sold. That intention helps explain the memoir's restraint without turning restraint into virtue or Gilbert's candour into wrongdoing. The book served different purposes. Their difference did, however, leave the public with unequal material. Gilbert supplied scenes and pain. Anderson supplied limits and work. A vivid accusation is easier to repeat than the statement that two people were simply not friends. The more often Gilbert's language circulated, the more Anderson became a character inside Gilbert's memoir rather than a separate witness to the same years. Anderson sometimes answered defensively. In one interview, she suggested that people writing memoirs were also trying to sell books. The remark could sound dismissive of Gilbert's experience, just as Gilbert's labels could flatten Anderson's. Adult distance had not made either woman perfectly neutral. By 2010, the central question had changed. During the production, the question had been why television sisterhood failed to become private closeness. After the books, the question was why contact could occur without changing the hardened stories each woman carried. They had met over the false report in 1981. They had shared the wider space of Landon's funeral. Their accounts could now be placed beside each other on a shelf. Still, there was no sustained friendship. The reason cannot be reduced to a single unresolved incident. Daily work had ended. Separate lives had become established. Gilbert's pain and Anderson's privacy each made sense inside the woman's own history. Public attention rewarded the sharpest disagreement, while a genuine conversation would have required something publicity could not provide. Time without an audience, and curiosity about a memory that might not match one's own. Nothing in the record shows that conversation happening then. Instead, the public story sharpened. On January 22, 2014, Gilbert appeared on Watch What Happens Live with Andy Cohen. Anderson was not present. Asked about her former screen sister, Gilbert began by saying she would be gentle. She was not. In a fast answer shaped for a comic late-night setting, Gilbert called Anderson hateful, mean, and difficult. She said they had never been close, not even for a moment. She repeated allegations that Anderson had hit her and added a memory of being elbowed off a covered wagon. The remarks were real. Their most serious interpretation remains uncertain. No located independent source establishes Anderson's intent in the wagon incident or confirms a deliberate pattern of physical cruelty. The answer demonstrates how charged Gilbert's memory remained. It does not turn the absent child's motive into a settled fact. If the women's story had stopped with that broadcast, the word feud might have seemed sufficient. Then the calendar supplied a contradictory image. 98 days later, on April 30th, Gilbert and Anderson sat in the same television reunion. Today had gathered cast members for the 40th anniversary of Little House. Karen Grassel sat with the actresses who had played her daughters. Alison Arngrim, Lindsay Greenbush, Dean Butler, Matthew Labiauto, and Michael Landon Jr. joined them. The original opening appeared on a studio screen. 3 girls ran down the hill. Grassel said the sight brought tears because she was sitting with the daughters together for the first time since Landon's funeral. Gilbert, watching the image of her younger self, was visibly moved. Anderson sat inside that circle of memory. The arrangement did not isolate the two Melissas for a dramatic reveal. Grassel's presence joined them to the household they had performed, while Arngrim and the other cast members widened the conversation beyond one relationship. When the opening played, the evidence before them was not a rumour or a memoir passage. It was the work, children moving downhill through a landscape, preserved at the ages when none of them could know how often adults would replay the image. Gilbert and Anderson did not need to agree about childhood in order to watch it together. They needed only to remain in the same present tense room while the clip turned them into children again. The group spoke about Landon's work habits and the family atmosphere viewers remembered. Michael Landon Jr. represented the person whose absence organised the emotion in the studio. The conversation did not turn toward the private history between Gilbert and Anderson, and neither woman forced it there. That restraint was itself observable. They could let the shared programme be the subject. They did not use a 40th anniversary broadcast to litigate childhood or perform a closeness they had never claimed. The contrast with January is stronger than any invented confrontation could be. Gilbert had spoken harshly on television. Less than 3.5 months later, both women accepted a place in a group celebration. They were capable of professional coexistence, even when Gilbert's private recollections remained painful. No evidence shows that they discussed the Watch What Happens live answer. The Today appearance offered no announcement of an apology, a private meeting, or a new friendship. The emotional centre was the series and the absent Landon, not a settlement between Mary and Laura. The reunion did change the public record in one decisive way. It made an absolute no-contact story impossible. The women could sit in the same studio, watch their childhoods, and participate in a shared tribute. Then they could leave without becoming confidants. That is not failure. A public anniversary asks former co-workers to honour common work. It does not create the conditions for personal repair. Cameras, time limits, prepared clips, and a group conversation make nostalgia possible. They do not necessarily make honesty safe. The Today sofa was contact without a new relationship state. 10 years would pass before Anderson entered a different kind of room and reconsidered the child she'd been. Those 10 years did not contain a known dramatic event between the women. Their relationship returned to its familiar condition, a shared history that could place them in the same public story without producing a private one. The absence of action is easy to misread. When people know two former colleagues are not friends, every separate appearance can look intentional. A declined invitation becomes a boycott. A quiet year becomes hostility. Yet adult schedules, family obligations, health, travel, and preference create distance every day without anyone declaring war. The 50th anniversary of Little House offered a clear test of that temptation. From March 22nd through the 24th of 2024, fans and cast members gathered in Simi Valley, California. The place carried the physical memory of the production: open land, the landscape associated with Walnut Grove, and a crowd eager to stand near the people who had made the series. Gilbert attended with other former cast members. Anderson was not among the documented participants. There is no verified explanation for her absence. The fact belongs in the chronology. A motive does not. 3 months later, the Monte Carlo Television Festival honoured Little House in Monaco. The initial announcement named Gilbert and Anderson among those expected. When the festival took place from June 14th through the 18th, the final group included Anderson, Karen Grassel, Alison Arngrim, Matthew Labuteau, Wendy Lou Lee, and Leslie Landon. Gilbert was not there. Again, the sources establish attendance, not intention. The separate events do not show the women avoiding one another. They show that each was willing to re-enter the legacy in a different place, before either publicly announced a renewed relationship. Anderson's appearance in Monaco carried special weight because she had spent so much of adult life outside the circuit of cast publicity. She stood with people from the production, accepted the continuing affection of viewers, and participated in an anniversary built around a past she had once kept carefully contained. Gilbert's appearance in Simi Valley reflected a different continuity. Little House had never stopped moving through her public life. She had written about it, spoken about it, built later work around ideas of home and community, and returned more easily to the cast world. The 50th anniversary did not put Mary and Laura together. It placed the actresses on parallel paths toward the same history. That was a visible change in Anderson's public engagement, even without a documented change between the women. In 1981, she had wanted to move beyond a role whose possibilities seemed exhausted. In 1998, ordinary family life had become a relief. In 2010, she wrote a professional memoir while withholding much of the personal material readers expected. By 2024, she could sit before an interviewer for nearly an hour and look directly at how she had inhabited those years. The interview with Harvey Brownstone was released on November 5th. It did not place Anderson inside a crowded cast reunion, where every answer had to compete with someone else's memory. The conversation was hers. The form of the conversation mattered. Brownstone allowed Anderson to stay with an answer instead of competing for time inside a cast reunion. She sometimes corrected herself. separated what she knew from what she could no longer place, and returned to the practical decisions that had shaped the work. That manner supplied something the shorter archive often lacked. Not another list of episodes, but the logic by which Anderson connected them. Preparation had given a shy child control. Public discipline had protected a career. The same habits had also limited spontaneity and left other children to interpret the quiet from outside. The interview did not make every memory final. It made the limits visible while giving Anderson enough time to describe the person who had lived behind the working child. Brownstone also asked about the person underneath the work. Anderson said acting had given a shy child something she could improve through effort. It supplied a measurable task. She could learn, repeat, adjust, and know when she had done better. That did not mean the rest of identity developed at the same speed. She said understanding who she was had taken decades. She called herself perfectionistic and hard on herself. At the end of a day, she replayed events in her mind. The habit was not presented as a charming sign of dedication. It was part of the pressure she placed on herself. Then Anderson returned to the fear of trouble. As a child, she did not want a headline announcing bad behavior. She did not want to create a problem for the adults who depended on her. The old memory of Landon's reassuring nighttime call fitted into a wider pattern. She said she feared bad behavior headlines and worked hard to avoid trouble. Finally, Anderson named regret. She wished she'd been more outgoing. She wished she'd been easygoing enough to enjoy more of what was happening around her. The statement did not answer Gilbert incident by incident. Anderson did not discuss the fabric, the wagon, or the words spoken on Watch What Happens Live. She did not claim that shyness excused every effect her behavior had on other children. She described what the years had looked like from within her own life. That changed the available meaning of reserve. For decades, the public story often asked which woman was telling the truth. Gilbert remembered coldness and hurt. Anderson remembered professionalism and little relationship at all. The 2024 interview did not choose a winner. It showed that Anderson described her reserve as shyness, listening, caution, and fear of mistakes, while Gilbert experienced it as rejection. Gilbert's experience remains real, even if Anderson's intention was different. Anderson's inner account remains her own, even if it did not prevent hurt. The new evidence did not repair the relationship. No source says Gilbert watched the interview. No source connects Brownstone's questions to the first later call. The interview changed what an audience could understand. Whether it changed anything between the women is unknown. That boundary keeps the chronology honest. Adult self-understanding can open a door without identifying who walks through it first. By their 60s, Gilbert and Anderson were no longer measuring themselves inside a production hierarchy. The childhood rank attached to 9 and 11 no longer defined them. Neither depended on the other for screen time, approval, or position. Mary and Laura were fixed in film, but the women were no longer required to stand where those characters had placed them. Time created those conditions. Time did not create the friendship. The evidence for change appears before December 27, 2025, but it does not supply a beginning date. Gilbert later described long, healing talks filled with memories, catching up, laughter, and a few tears. Anderson did not publish a matching account, and no reliable source identifies who first reached out, what medium they used, or whether anyone apologized. That uncertainty does not erase the change in conduct. In 1981, an outside story had pushed them into one narrow conversation. Compare the report, agree that it hurt, and move on. Gilbert's later use of the plural talks described something sustained enough to include 2 adult lives and the years in which no friendship had existed. Healing is Gilbert's word, not a public verdict on which childhood memory was correct. It does not prove that Anderson accepted every recollection, or that Gilbert withdrew every criticism. It means that, in Gilbert's account, talking altered how they carried the past. The public learned only after that private work had begun. On Friday, December 26th, Gilbert was performing off-Broadway at the DR2 Theatre in Manhattan. The play was Pen Pals, a story about two women whose connection survives decades, distance, and the exchange of letters. The title was almost too fitting, but the evening had not been arranged as a Little House reunion. Gilbert's co-star Vianne Cox had planned a surprise. Betty Buckley was in the audience. Gilbert later wrote that she was glad she had not known in advance. Gilbert had a secret guest of her own. Us Weekly reported that Gilbert had invited Anderson without announcing the plan in advance. Melissa Sue Anderson attended the performance. The action is simple and observable. Anderson went to the theatre where Gilbert was working. She watched her former screen sister perform. Afterward, Anderson joined Gilbert, Cox and Buckley backstage for a photograph. There was no Prairie costume, no reproduction of the Ingalls house, and no full cast arranged for an anniversary. Gilbert and Anderson were present because of Gilbert's current work, not because a network had asked Mary and Laura to return. That difference gave Anderson's attendance unusual meaning. She had already appeared at a 50th anniversary event in Monaco. A cast celebration could be explained as professional legacy. Pen Pals centered Gilbert's life in the present. Anderson chose to enter it. The photograph shows four women together against an ordinary backstage setting. It does not reveal the content of any private conversation. It does not need to. Its value lies in sequence. According to Gilbert's post, the talks came first. The theatre visit came after. The public announcement came the next day. On December 27th, Gilbert posted the picture. She wrote of worlds colliding, blessings, hearts healing, and reconnection with a sister. Then she named the work hidden before the photograph: long talks, memories, catching up, laughter, and tears. Gilbert said she was happy to have Anderson back in her life. She wrote that they shared a history no one else on earth truly understood. She called them the Ingalls girls. Her next sentence protected the truth of their childhood, even as it celebrated the present. The past, Gilbert said, was now the past, and they could move forward as the sisters and friends they had always wanted to be. The phrase does not rewrite the girls as secret friends. It acknowledges the relationship that failed to form and places the new friendship in choice rather than nostalgia. Mary and Laura had once made the wish look already fulfilled. Melissa and Melissa were now trying to fulfill it as adults. The first contact remains unknown. What can be said is that by December, Anderson was in the audience at Gilbert's invitation, and Gilbert wanted to share the resulting joy. Anderson did not publish a detailed companion account. That silence does not prove reluctance or enthusiasm. It makes Gilbert the public narrator of the change. Anderson's record was behavioural. According to Gilbert, she joined the private talks, then attended Pen Pals and stood in the backstage photograph. Headlines gave the photograph a clean before and after shape. Yet publicity was again compressing a slower process into a single visible moment. The change had occurred through private conversation before the camera arrived, and its durability could be measured only after the announcement. By December 2025, Gilbert was describing something more precise: sustained private closeness. Her words described the movement. Anderson's tendance made it visible. The timing of Pen Pals added a gentle coincidence. On stage, Gilbert had been performing a relationship maintained across distance by deliberate communication. Off stage, she was revealing that another long-separated relationship had changed, through talks the audience never heard. For viewers, the Christmas photograph looked like an ending. Yet the women's history already contained contact that changed little. The 1981 meeting, Landon's memorial, and the Today reunion. A photograph could prove presence, and Gilbert's caption could describe the private talks that preceded it. Neither could show whether the friendship continued after public attention moved on. That made the next 7 months a quiet test. Another anniversary appearance would prove only that the women could share public space. A stronger update would need to describe what had never existed during Little House or after it: ordinary care in the present. In July, the prompt came in directly. Gilbert encountered an article praising Anderson's appearance. Instead of leaving the compliment on the surface, she used it to explain what she now valued and what the two women had become. On July 23, 2026, Gilbert wrote that Anderson was beautiful, but that her inequalities made the beauty shine more brightly. Then she supplied the strongest evidence in the entire story. Anderson, Gilbert said, had become a good and true confidant. She cared about her, checked on her, and made sure she was all right. Gilbert was grateful that they had been given the chance to reconnect and become real friends. This was not another reunion announcement. It was a description of continuing conduct almost 7 months after the backstage photograph. Gilbert then opened the store of childhood the two women carried. She remembered peppermint sticks and tin cups. She remembered Jasper the raccoon and the puppies they rescued. She remembered sitting across from Anderson in the schoolroom with Mrs. Minier. The objects were no longer merely props from episodes. They were coordinates in a childhood only these two actresses had occupied from opposite sides. Gilbert also revised the old hierarchy. As a girl, she had looked up to Anderson. She remembered Anderson as graceful and pretty while seeing herself as buck-toothed and goofy. Admiration had lived beside the hurt all along, even when the hurt was easier to say in public. Now, Gilbert wrote, they were absolute contemporaries. That may be the quiet answer to why friendship became possible so late. Time erased the childhood rank, but time alone did not repair anything. It passed through the 1981 meeting, the 1991 memorial, the memoirs, the harsh words of 2014, and the 50th anniversary year. Contact happened before. Public reunion happened before. Neither created closeness. In Gilbert's account, deliberate conversation changed the relationship. The strongest proof was no longer the sequence of public events. Checking on someone is small enough to occur when there is no anniversary, audience, or photograph. That ordinary scale moved the relationship beyond the symbolism of Mary and Laura. That is why Real Friends is more accurate than a dramatic peace treaty. A treaty would require a proven war, named offences, and terms of settlement. The evidence gives us no formal apology and no final ruling on every childhood memory. It gives us two adults choosing contact where distance had once been easier. What existed in childhood was real work, shared time, and believable sisterhood on film. What did not exist was the private bond viewers imagined. Gilbert's pain remains part of that history. Anderson's shyness, ambition, restraint, and independent choices belong there too. Neither woman has to become the villain for the ending to matter. Gilbert said they would be sisters forever because they held each other's childhoods in their hearts. To hold another person's childhood is not to own the only correct version of it. It is to remember the child behind the adult story and to allow that child more than one meaning. Mary and Laura will always be young together. Melissa Gilbert and Melissa Sue Anderson had to grow old enough to choose what the characters were given from the beginning. The television sisterhood came first. The real friendship came after 50 years. Good night.